So, Lone Rider here, and I wanted to talk about cutlasses. This is in particular a review, as it were, of a reproduction of the French 1801 boarding cutlass. Except right off the bat, you'll notice this doesn't exactly look like an 1801, and there's a reason for that. The 1801 has a large bowl guard on this side, and I removed that. It was braced on. You can see some remnants there of the brass. The reason I removed it is twofold. One, it's an asymmetrical guard that's not very lefty friendly. And two, I didn't really want necessarily a reproduction of the 1801. This just happened to be the sort I got my hands on. What I wanted was more of an older style, almost like a hanger, not a proper cutlass. A hanger being a short saber that could be used like a cutlass at sea, but also could be used on land by soldiers, pikemen, infantrymen, etc. They were very popular in the 18th century, in the 1700s, and I actually have an original one somewhere upstairs. But this has the advantage, of course, of being a cutlass that essentially has a modified hilt. So the hilt is more like a hanger, just a simple knuckle bow with a little bit of a guard up here. But the blade, of course, is much more robust, as befits a cutlass. So right away, it doesn't look like an 1801 because I took the bowl guard off. I did that on purpose. Now, the 1801 is very similar to a later sword from the 1830s. Now, the main difference is this part here, the quillion. On this sword, as you can see, it has 5 distinct lobes. It looks almost like a bundle of grapes, essentially. I mean, if you turn it like this. The one from the 1830s is almost identical, except the quillion here is just a single stub on that one. And they both have that bowl guard. Now, in terms of construction, you've got a carbon steel blade. You have a steel guard and bowl. And you have a steel grip, steel pommel cap, and I believe it's peened construction with a washer or perhaps even a nut under the peen. You can see that round thing, and then there's what looks like a little bit of the tang showing through. If you look through the gap right under the knuckle bow here with a flashlight, you can see the tang inside, so the tang does go all the way down to the end. Like I said, the guard, the grip, the bottom is steel. All very similar to the original. Same thing with the blade. You have a 26-inch or thereabouts blade with a very wide spine. And the spine is actually much wider than a lot of reproductions. Starts out very wide, gets a little narrower, and it stays pretty... You do have what's called distal taper, where it narrows on the back. But it stays pretty narrow to about... Or stays pretty wide, rather, till about here. And this is where it starts to really narrow. And that's about where the fuller ends, which is more or less on par with the originals from what I've heard from people who have handled or owned original ones. The markings are similar to what you might see on an actual 1801. You've got an anchor here on both sides of the blade, lightly engraved, and then you have markings on the spine. In this case, it says in script, manufactured the something de Klingenthal, which is one of the arsenals where they made them. French swords are known to be very well marked, usually on the spines of the blades, and often the writing is in script, as on this example. Of course, this is a reproduction, but they did a nice job with that there. The pictures I've seen of originals, the anchors are usually canted at an angle. Here they're straight on, so that that's as may be, but. And then you have a single wide shallow fuller that goes to about there, and it's narrow on the back from there down, and then narrow on the front. Now I've sharpened this from about here down, and then I've also sharpened a little bit of the false edge there. This is an incredibly good cutter. Once it's sharpened, it's also extremely good at thrusting. It's a very stiff blade and has a very acute point. And although it is curved, it's slightly curved. It's straight enough that the point is more or less in line with it curves like this, so the point is more or less in line with your hand. It does not have what's called a spear point. The point is essentially in line with the back of the blade. but the point is still more or less in line with the hand. It's not a spear point blade would probably thrust even better, but this allows you to cut all the way down to the tip. If you think of like a 1796 light cavalry saber, or even a katana, essentially, any type of sword with a edge curves all the way, and then the point's more or less in line with the back. That's what you have here. It does come forward slightly. The back isn't entirely straight at the point. It does come forward slightly, but it's mostly still in line with the back there. And like I said, it cuts very well, thrusts very well. Is not light. Point of balance is about there, which, according to my handy dandy ruler, is, let me see here, about 5 inches from the guard, maybe a little more, 5 and a fraction inches. But like I said, it's somewhat blade heavy. It's got a very robust blade. It's a Cutlass. They're supposed to. This spine, which is very thick here, a lot thicker at the base than a lot of reproductions, and then stays fairly thick despite narrowing slightly towards the end of the fuller, is similar to the way the spine is in some of the originals. So that would I have not handled an original 1801, but my assumption would be it would handle in a similar fashion. And once you start swinging this, it does want to swing. It doesn't want to cut. It is kind of tiresome to use in one hand if you're not used to that sort of thing. There's a belief that big two-handed swords are a lot harder to use because they're big and they're two-handed. The reality is a big two-handed sword may be slightly heavier than a one-handed sword, but the difference is you're sharing the work between both hands. So something like a longsword, for example, is actually less tiring than a lot of one-handed swords. Also, a lot of one-handed swords, if you're talking about, as long as you're not talking about medieval swords, if you're talking about anything that has any kind of a complex guard, whether it's just a knuckle bow like this, or whether it's a bowl guard like this originally came, or whether it's a basket hilt or a swept hilt or whatever, those tend to be held out more at arm's length. And of course, a lot of saber and cutlass guards are going to be like this or like this. So the sword is going to be held out further away from the body, essentially. And what that means is that it's not just that you're having to do all the work with one hand. It's that the way you're holding it is actually more tiring because you're holding it in such a way that it's held out, and a sort of a lever effect takes over. It's all that weight's at the end of your extended arm, so it's going to be more tiring to use in that respect. Very fun thing though, and whether you're just a fan of the 18th and 19th century, militaria, or you like me, you're just into swords, and one of the swords that you think are kind of cool are sabers, and you wanted a short saber. Well, that's kind of what this is, essentially, a short, really beefy saber. Or, if you just think pirates are cool and you want a cutlass. I mean, it's, although, of course, the 18th century style of hanger is probably more appropriate for that in terms of, the golden age of piracy was pretty much done by the mid, or let's say early to mid 1700s, which means that by the time the 1801 was actually invented, they didn't have pirates in the traditional sense, like Blackbeard or any of those folks. Of course, pirates are still around. I mean, you look at the the Somalis with AK-47s, but that doesn't seem quite as cool as swords and rum and all that jazz. So whether you're just, hey, pirates are cool, I want a cutlass to hang on the wall, or whether you're into historical swordsmanship and you want to practice saber, and a cutlass is an adorable short saber and it's easy to handle. A typical saber blade would probably be around 32 inches long or something. So a 26-inch blade, I mean, is a lot handier. So if you do want to practice like me, I don't really use this outside. I practice cutting stuff in the garage. At some point when I move, I'll have hopefully the ability to, have a yard where I'll have a big fence or, whatever. I won't have to worry about scaring the sheep. But yeah, right now I'm not going to go outside and cut stuff in my yard where all the neighbors can see me and might get, a little nervous. Especially these days, anything with weapons, people tend to, always draw the wrong conclusions. I mean, a couple of the guys from the local fencing club, they do practice in their own yards, but I'm just not comfortable doing that. But if you have to practice indoors, shorter blade is definitely less likely to break the lamp, break the ceiling, or whatever. So can't argue with that. Now the story behind these, I got these from a place called IMA, International Military Antiques, and the story behind these is that they're not a new made reproduction, which might account for the really thick spine and especially really thick down here, thicker than a lot of modern reproductions. Apparently these were made back in the 80s and they were just kind of in storage for a while. And so, they're selling them off and they're fairly cheap. I mean, this is a $99 sword and it handles like a sword and cuts like a sword that costs way more than that. It is blade heavy. You're not going to be doing a lot of elegant, disengages with this, but it's a cutlass. I mean, that's what it's for. It's not for that. It's for, chopping and slicing and, all that sort of thing. So if you're in the market for a good cutlass for whatever reason, again, whether you do historical swordsmanship, whether you're into swords, you're into history, you think one would look cool on your wall, you watched, Black Sails or Pirates of the Caribbean too many times, whatever, consider one of these. And again, it's a reproduction of the 1801 French boarding cutlass, mine, of course, being modified by removing the bowl guard. One caveat, the blade has a very high degree of polish, but it may not be without blemishes. Mine, at the very end near the tip, there's a little bit of marking down there. Like I said, these are not a new item. They were made and used and then put in storage after being, made some years ago. So there may be some imperfections or blemishes. A high polished blade is beautiful, but unfortunately it shows any blemishes or scratches, which is another thing. If you're planning to cut with this rather than just hang it on the wall, I don't know if you can see, but there are some scratches on the blade right around here, which is the part you're going to be cutting with from here up. And, some of those might have been sharpening mistakes, but you can see some of them go all the way up the side there. I don't know if the light will pick that up. That's from cutting with it. So, you got to try and keep it polished. And even then, so that's the one caveat. The second thing is that, and this is all on me, because the first thing I did when I got this sword was take a hammer and chisel and remove the brazed on bowl guard. In doing so, I clamped the blade in the vise rather than the guard. So all the force of the hammering and chiseling was actually directed at the guard, which was free to move however it was going to move, because it's not like I clamped the guard in the vise and then chiseled the bowl off. I clamped the blade, the fort of the blade in the vise after wrapping it so it wouldn't be marred. Now the problem with that is the guard and the handle ended up slightly loose. You can't really feel it. There's a little bit of wiggle, not much, but again, that's entirely on me. I mean, as long as the first thing you do when you get a brand new sword is you don't start banging on it with a hammer and a chisel, you should be fine. Or if you do have to, like me, decide you want to remove the bowl guard, don't do what I did and clamp it by the blade. Clamp the guard itself so that when you're hammering on the guard doesn't move and get a little loose. So there you go. This is a very robust, well-made thing. And for the price, you cannot beat it. So if you're looking for a saber or a cutlass, or even if you want to, grind the peen off, take the handle off, however you take it off, and actually remount the blade on something else, as long as you don't mind the fact that it has this anchor and French markings on the back. This would even be a good, for $99, you've got a great serviceable blade you could use to make, a falchion, a messer, anything else, depending on how you wanted to rehilt it. But yeah, as a cutlass, it's great. It's sturdy. Like I said, steel guard, steel grip, etc. There's only one problem I have with it in use, and I almost forgot to mention this. The grip is octagonal. It's got flat sides, flat front and back, and then, cut off corners. Great for edge alignment, especially with the flat sides. The problem is there's no real texture on it this way. No ribbing, no spiral wrapping, no grippy surface. So there's a tendency for this in hand to move, especially if your hand is slick or sweaty or greasy or anything. So what I've done is I've just worn a light glove while using this to make sure it doesn't slip. Because the last thing you want to do is have a sharp sword slip out of your hand and go, let's say, flying across the room, just for safety's sake. Another thing you could do is what was sometimes done historically with sabers. I don't think it was ever done with cutlasses, but if you're going to use this as a short saber, I guess you could, is tie a loop of string or paracord or something to the guard here, and then just loop your hand through it, twist it once or twice, and that works as sort of a lanyard, or what they called in Victorian times a sword knot. Like I said, that was done with sabers. I don't believe it was ever done with cutlasses, which is probably the reason there's no actual hole in the guard here. A lot of the sabers from the time period would have a slot specifically for a sword knot. But yeah, that, except for the fact that the grip doesn't really have any texture on it, it is kind of smooth. This is just excellent in the hand and excellent to swing around. Like I said, it's kind of blade heavy, but it's a cutlass. It's supposed to be. So for the price, you get a really good sword, really well made. If you're interested in historical accuracy and you want to leave the bull guard on, it's a very accurate reproduction of the 1801. And yeah, wicked cool cutlass. Lone Rider out.